My name is John, and I have been a night watchman at our town cemetery for 10 years. This job isn't for everyone, but I've grown accustomed to its eerie tranquility. Patrolling the graveyard at night, checking the tombstones, and occasionally assisting late-night visitors have become routine tasks for me. However, nothing could have prepared me for the chilling encounter I had last month. It was a particularly dark night, with heavy clouds obscuring the moon and casting an unsettling shadow over the cemetery. The wind whispered through the trees, creating an eerie symphony of rustling leaves and creaking branches. As the clock struck midnight, I began my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, prepared for anything out of the ordinary. As I approached the neglected family plot at the far end of the cemetery, I noticed a faint flicker of light among the weathered tombstones. Curiosity and a sense of duty led me closer to investigate. Amidst the overgrown grass and crumbling monuments, I saw a figure, a young girl no older than 12, sitting cross-legged beside an ancient grave marker. Her presence struck me as odd, especially at such a late hour and in such a desolate place. She wore a simple white dress that seemed out of place against the backdrop of decay and neglect. I cautiously approached her, trying not to startle her. "Hello there," I greeted softly, unsure of what to expect. The girl turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't speak but motioned towards the grave beside her, a weather-beaten stone with the name Emily etched into its surface. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the significance of the name. Emily was a name that haunted the cemetery's records, a young girl who had passed away tragically in the 1920s, her story lost to time and neglect. The girl before me bore a striking resemblance to the faded photograph I had seen in the archives. "Are you Emily?" I asked tentatively, my voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded solemnly, her expression a mix of sadness and longing. "They forgot about me," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the whispering wind. "I've been waiting for someone to remember." My mind raced with disbelief and apprehension. How could this be happening? Was I dreaming? Or was there truly a spirit before me, trapped in the realm between the living and the dead? Summoning my courage, I reached out a hand, offering to help her up. To my surprise, she accepted my offer, her hand cold and ethereal in mine. Together, we stood beside the weathered grave marker, a silent testament to a life cut short and forgotten by the passage of time. "Can you help me find my way home?" Emily's voice trembled with hope, her eyes pleading for release from the spectral limbo that bound her to this place. I nodded, my heart heavy with compassion and determination. "I'll do everything I can," I promised, unsure of how to fulfill such a solemn vow. For the next few nights, Emily's presence lingered in the cemetery, her spirit growing stronger with each passing visit. Together, we uncovered fragments of her forgotten past, a loving family torn apart by tragedy, a community haunted by guilt and remorse. With each visit, I brought flowers to adorn Emily's grave, a small gesture of remembrance and reconciliation. Together, we whispered prayers into the night, hoping to find solace and redemption amidst the shadows of the past. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's spirit began to fade, her ethereal presence growing fainter with each passing night. One moonlit evening, she appeared before me for the last time, her form translucent and ephemeral against the backdrop of the midnight sky. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a soft echo of the wind. "I can finally rest." With a gentle smile, Emily turned towards the horizon, her spirit merging with the night's embrace. In that fleeting moment, I felt a sense of peace and closure, a bond forged through compassion and shared sorrow. Since that fateful encounter, the cemetery has held a new significance for me, a sanctuary of memories and forgotten stories where the echoes of the past linger in the shadows. And though Emily's spirit has found peace, her memory remains etched in my heart, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and remembrance. My name is Michael, and I've been working at this cemetery for 10 years. Initially, night patrols and grave diggings used to unsettle me, but I've grown accustomed to it over time. The most disturbing aspect of this job is the realization that anything unusual can emerge in the cemetery. One night last week, the air was dark and silent. The moon was hidden in the sky, with stars casting a faint light. The silence of the cemetery enveloped the surroundings oppressively. I began my night patrol, flashlight in hand, checking the tombstones when suddenly I heard a sound. As cemetery workers, we're accustomed to hearing sounds, but this time the sound was different, like a faint murmur mixed with the whispering wind. I advanced to find the source and saw a colleague standing beside an old, neglected grave. "Joe, is that you?" I asked, but received no response. My colleague's face was pale and troubled, eyes staring into emptiness. I approached with concern. "What's wrong?" I asked again, but still no answer. Suddenly, my colleague's eyes turned towards me, and he began to speak slowly, his voice filled with sorrow and darkness. "I've been here for a long time," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "This cemetery belongs to me. It should belong to me." These words shocked me because I couldn't imagine Joe saying such a thing normally. We had never experienced anything like this in all the years we've spent in the cemetery. But now, Joe's soul seemed trapped here, disconnected from the past. "Joe, I'll take you," I said, reaching out to help him. But Joe's face was expressionless and distant, as if he couldn't hear me. For a moment, I felt helpless, unsure of what to do. Joe's condition disturbed me because he was no longer just a friend. He stood before me as a presence in the cemetery. I called out to him again, but still got no response. Finally, I had to step back. I was alone in the cemetery, and Joe's presence still lingered around me. I retreated in fear and waited through the night without hearing another sound. Since that day, working in the cemetery hasn't been the same for me. I still feel like Joe's soul wanders here, disconnected from the past. This experience deeply affected me and taught me to be more cautious when wandering the cemetery. A few nights later, Joe's presence became more pronounced. During night patrols, I began to see his silhouette in the corners of the cemetery. Once, I heard footsteps approaching rapidly, and when I turned, I saw Joe's pale face staring at me. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, as if searching for something. "Joe, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. But Joe just quietly approached me, his face expressionless. I took a step towards him, but he suddenly stopped and whispered to me, "Help me. I don't want to stay here." These words shocked me, and my heart began to race. Joe's presence and his helplessness stood before me as a mysterious entity wandering the cemetery. But this time, there was more than just his suffering soul. I felt something was wrong in the cemetery, something beyond my control. As the night progressed, the wind intensified, and I heard a chilling scream from the gravestones. I quickly looked around and noticed Joe had disappeared suddenly. I held my breath for a moment, scanning the cemetery, but found no trace of Joe. The next day, the unsettling atmosphere in the cemetery persisted. When I spoke to other workers, they shared the same concern. Some mentioned strange sounds and sightings they'd experienced recently. They hesitated to discuss what was happening in the cemetery, fearing the buildup of their own hidden fears. A few nights later, while patrolling the cemetery alone at night, I saw a shadow for a moment. When I turned quickly, I saw Joe's pale face staring at me again, but this time, something was different. His eyes gleamed with fear and helplessness, as if something was trying to harm him. "You need to run," Joe whispered, his voice trembling. "You're not safe here." Suddenly, several shadows appeared around me and quickly moved among the gravestones. My heart began to race, and I stepped back trembling, but the shadows continued to approach me with each step. I started to run in fear, passing through the gravestones, feeling the shadows chasing me quickly. For a moment, I held my breath and hid behind a gravestone, watching the shadows silently move around me. Holding my breath, I waited for the shadows to disappear. I feared something would happen at any moment, but a few minutes later, the silence returned and the shadows vanished. I slowly looked around and saw no trace of Joe's presence. Since that day, walking alone in the cemetery has become difficult for me. Joe's presence and the strange events in the cemetery still disturb me. When I was a little girl, maybe 3 or 4, I know, how could I remember something from such a young age? Honestly, I don't know, but I have vivid memories of certain things from a very young age. Anyway, my mother took my grandmother and great-grandmother to visit a grave one afternoon. I don't know who they were visiting. I was bored and thought I saw a white cat walk behind one of the headstones to my left. So being a kid, I went to find the cat. When I got to the headstone, it had gone. I assumed it had wandered out of sight and turned to walk back to my mom. Then it was there again. This time I could see it clearly, instead of out the corner of my eye. It wasn't a cat. It looked like a sheet, like satin, just floating close to the ground. I could only see a small bit of it before it disappeared behind another headstone. Again, I thought possibly a plastic bag, maybe. I went back to my mom and stood by her side. I kept seeing it, always in my periphery. My grandmother noticed how my attention kept being drawn to random places around us and asked me what I was looking at. I told her that I kept seeing a white bag floating about. She looked around and asked where. I pointed toward an area just to the right of us, and she said she couldn't see anything, and that the bag had probably been blown away. We started to make our way back to the car, walking through the cemetery. I didn't feel scared. I had no reason to at such a young age, especially of a white plastic bag floating about in the wind. About halfway to the car, I turned to my grandmother and laughed. "Look, Nanny, the bag is following us." Her head snapped round, and she caught a glimpse of something. She stopped in her tracks and watched as it appeared again behind another headstone on the opposite side of the path. "Okay, let's get moving," she said suddenly. Our group started walking fast toward the exit. I've never seen my grandmother move as fast as she did that day. She was obviously spooked. So I laughed and said, "Nanny, don't worry. It can't hurt you. It's only a bag, remember?" She smiled at me as she fastened the pace again. No one said another word until we were halfway home. My grandmother later casually mentioned in passing that me, had seen a ghost at the cemetery, to me when I was about 8. That the bag I had seen floating wasn't a bag and was something else. That she too had seen it, but that it wasn't there to scare us, but to watch over us.